Okay, I am back. All right, here's the deal. The Supreme Court justices have decided to weigh in on the scope of the obstruction charge that is central to the case against the Orange Jesus dog-faced fuckwad Donald Trump. The court agreed today to decide a question at the heart of the federal elections interference case. Now, as we know, the Orange Bastard and hundreds of prosecutions that have arisen from the assault on the Capitol, a question has now come up. And the question is, can the government charge defendants in those cases under a federal law that makes it a crime to corruptly obstruct an official congressional proceeding? That's the question that is now before the Supreme Court. And you might say, like I did when I saw this article in the New York Times today, like, what the fuck are you talking about? I mean, there's a question? Now, the decision by this Supreme Court is going to complicate, and this is what the Orange Bastard's attorneys, this is what their objective was. It's going to complicate and possibly delay the start of the Orange Bastard's trial, which is now scheduled to take place starting in March. And the ultimate ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court may not come until June, but it will likely address the viability of two of the main counts against Trump and could severely limit efforts by Jack Smith to hold this orange Nazi accountable for the violence that his supporters committed on January 6, 2021. And the court's eventual decision could also invalidate convictions that have already been secured against scores of the Nazi pig bastard followers of Donald Trump who took part in the assault. Now, the case the court agreed to hear, what this is all about, it involves a little Nazi prick named Joseph Fischer. He was indicted on 7 charges for his role in the Capitol attack. Prosecutors show, they have the evidence, that he assaulted the police as Congress met to certify the results. And like hundreds of others of these scum, whose actions disrupted the certification proceedings in the Capitol, this little Nazi bastard, Fischer, was charged with the obstruction count. Now, Fischer sought dismissal of a part of the indictment brought under the federal law, which was passed back in 2002. And this statute was primarily aimed at white-collar crime. A judge, Carl Nichols of the Federal District Court in D.C., granted Fischer's motion, saying, this is what the judge said in this federal district court. The judge said that the law required people charged with this crime to, quote, take some action with respect to a document, record, or other object, end quote. And that's a provision, that requirement, that Judge Nichols of the Federal District Court failed to find in the Nazi Fischer's conduct on January 6th. And then a divided 3-judge panel on the U.S. Court of Appeals reversed the judge's decision, and the Court of Appeals ruled that the law, quote, applies to all forms of corrupt obstruction of an official proceeding, end quote. And then 3 January 6 defendants, including the Nazi Fischer, ultimately asked the Supreme Court to decide whether the law had been justly applied to the filth that were involved in the January 6th attack. You see where this is going? Periods and semicolons and commas and tenses of the words used in the law. The law says that some action with respect to a document, record, or other object, that there has to be some attempt to a document, a record, or other object, a physical tearing it up, ripping it out of a person's hands, whatever. And these filthy bastards who attacked the Capitol, they weren't able to do that because the Capitol Police and the Secret Service removed everybody to safe rooms to get them away from this horde of morons and assholes and people who want to destroy the Republic. Now, the obstruction charge, obstructing the proceedings of a legitimate proceeding by the Congress, that charge was never an easy fit in the cases stemming from the storming of the Capitol. And when that law was passed back in 2002, the law was aimed at curbing corporate thievery and lies and malfeasance by outlawing things like destroying documents or tampering with evidence. I mean, who would have thought back in 2002 that this law might be applied to people who are trying to overthrow the government? Now, defense lawyers, if that's what they want to call themselves, who are representing the people on January 6th who tried to destroy this republic, those defense lawyers argue that federal prosecutors improperly stretched the scope of that law to cover the violence that erupted at the Capitol and interfered with that proceeding in which lawmakers had gathered to certify the results of the 2020 election. And these so-called lawyers who are cooperating in the overthrow, the destruction of the United States, they also took issue with using this charge against people who stormed the Capitol, the ones who didn't make it inside. These lawyers said that many were not acting corruptly because, which is what the law requires, because these bastards believed they were protesting a stolen election. What? I mean, this is like saying I can go rob a bank, fully armed, threatening people's lives, walk out with all the money I can stuff into briefcases, and when it comes time for my trial, I can say, well, the only money I thought I was taking, was money the bank had that was deposited by corrupt drug dealers. Now, how far do you think that would go in a court of law? But to me, just to me, that's exactly what these so-called defense attorneys are saying. That the people who attacked the Capitol of the United States and tried to overthrow the government were doing so because they believed they were protesting a stolen election. Well. A lawyer for Jake Lang, who also appealed his obstruction conviction to the Supreme Court, this lawyer said, quote, the statute has been used to over-criminalize the January 6 cases. Congress never intended that, end quote. Well, you rotten son of a bitch fake lawyer, Congress never thought that a Christian devil like Donald Trump would inspire Christian demons in the House and the Senate and in the general public to try to overthrow the government. So, now this attorney, a lawyer for one of the little Nazi bastards, this Nazi bastard is named Jake Lang, who also appealed his obstruction conviction. The lawyer representing him also said the Supreme Court's review was, in the lawyer's term, significant in hundreds of criminal cases stemming from the riot at the Capitol, and was also, quote, yet another reason the 2024 cases against Donald Trump should be delayed, end quote. Now, we knew this would be the primary response by this criminal son of a rotten bitch, Donald Trump. You see, no matter what happens, regarding the crimes he's charged with and the investigations that are ongoing. If he gains the White House again, he can make all of this stop immediately and go away forever. That is somehow the crazy power that the framers of the U.S. Constitution vested in the executive. I had no idea that the President of the United States, not until Trump came along, I had no idea that the avenues for corruption for the President were so broad and so available, and that he could do anything, the President could, and get away with it. I didn't know that. Did you? I never learned that in school. What I learned when I went to primary and secondary school, what I learned was the President of the United States is someone that we admire, somebody who follows the law, someone who helps establish the law. And then, of course, along came Richard Nixon, which kind of shattered that. But you see, Nixon was never put on trial. The corruption that Nixon and the pigs, the Nazis who worked around him, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, none of that, they went to prison, but none of this ever came out about Nixon, thanks to Gerald fucking Ford, who issued a blanket pardon. Not only could Nixon not be charged with a crime or put on trial, but the reality of what the son of a bitch did would never wind up in a courtroom and never be fully presented unless you were willing to wade through books and newspaper articles, never be fully presented to the American people. Had Gerald Ford not done that, had Richard Nixon been put on trial, on fucking trial, after he was kicked out of the after he resigned from the presidency, then perhaps it would have let a little junior prick criminal like Donald Trump understand that he better not try it or he would wind up in jail. But of course, that's not what happened. Now, 2 of the 4 counts in the federal election interference indictment that Trump is facing, 2 of them, are based on the obstruction charge. Even though we all know Trump wasn't on the premises. The orange bastard has been charged with personally obstructing the certification proceeding at the Capitol, and he's also facing a separate count of conspiring with others to obstruct the proceeding. Now, you and I better not speak for you. I, and possibly you, would take a look at everything that's been presented from the January 6th committee in the U.S. House to all the criminal investigations, aspects of which have been made public. We would come to the conclusion, wouldn't we, that Donald Trump is as guilty as any fucker in the history of this country who tried to overthrow the government of the United States. I mean, when does common sense end and these intricate little nuances in the law take over? And this is what the Supreme Court is going to decide. If the Supreme Court finds that this law, passed in 2002, does not apply to the mob attack against the Capitol, it could really cripple the plans by Jack Smith to pin the violence that took place on that day on the Orange Devil. Now, according to the Times, recent court papers in the election case filed by Jack Smith have strongly suggested the prosecutors are planning to use the obstruction charge as a way to show the jury graphic videos of the Capitol attack and perhaps even introduce testimony from rioters claiming that they stormed the building on Trump's instructions. Which is what happened. Which is exactly what happened. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy. 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.